So there are things I can just do and they might seem scary to someone else. And I'm like, this is just easy and awesome.
There's an argument case to say the system doesn't work. It doesn't work.
No one knows you exist. No one's listening to you. No one gives a shit, basically.
Today's guest, Martyn Sibley, is a social entrepreneur and has founded and co-founded several different businesses, including Accomable, Disability Horizons, and his most recent venture, Purple Goat Agency. It was a great conversation to have with Martyn today, particularly surrounding everything business, as well as some of the struggles when it comes to disability and employment, and just what it's like running a business day to day and being the CEO of one of the most successful disability marketing agencies in the world. I really do hope you enjoy this episode, so please sit back, relax, and enjoy. Welcome back to the Not Quite Pod. Today we've got Martyn with us. Martyn, do you just want to quickly introduce yourself, let everyone know a bit about yourself and who you are?
Absolutely. Thank you for having me, Charlie. And I'm Martyn. I guess lived experience of disability is I've got SMA, spinal muscular atrophy. I know we're going to get into a lot of this soon, but it's always that growing up, it was the least part of identity at the top of my brain. And then as I've got into career, professional life, work life, I've ended up getting very invested in disability inclusion. And so the disability things become more top of the brain, but from a job perspective. And that's been, almost coming up 20 years now of different things I've done around disability. So again, we can get into it, but I'm currently running Purple Goat Agency, as Charlie knows well, as he's been involved as an influencer with us, and his partner works for the agency as well. Gina, big shout out. So I'm sure we're going to get into loads of stuff, but I guess my bigger mission is around disability inclusion from a kind of work and life perspective.
Yeah, and one of the big things I wanted to jump into with you is sort of how your journey started, because obviously a lot of disabled people go into the entrepreneurial space because of the problems that we face in the sort of employment space and the issues that come up with that. So if you could just sort of tell us the beginning of your journey, because where you're at now, it seems like, most disabled people will say it's probably one of the most impactful agencies around at the moment. But how did you get there? Because I know from speaking to you that there's several steps that you've taken before you've got to Purple Goat. But for those of you who don't know, what's the journey been?
Yeah, so I guess to that, the lived experience side, the practically having SMA is I've been in a power chair since I was about 3 years old. I've never walked at all. So, life was always been getting around in a wheelchair. I've always needed quite a lot of physical care, which childhood was mum and dad and other family members. So a big part of my broader journey was going to uni, where, anyone not just goes to uni, but when you just sort of make a bit of a move away from home one way or another, is, it's a big deal. But for me, it was a doubly big deal because it involved people I'd never met literally having to see me naked, to put it bluntly. We can say, oh, I've got social care needs and it's all lovely and fluffy and lingo. But bluntly, 4 people that were assigned to help me when I went to Coventry University. I was age 19. I'd had care from other people at school and some agency care, but, there was no mum and dad around to help. And they were as, nervous and scared around it as I think I was. Yeah. So that, as scary as that was, getting through that awkwardness and that uncomfortable feeling opened up a world, because it meant, I went to uni, I got a degree. I also did a master's there. We can touch on the subject was very businessy, so we can get into business stuff a bit later. But to be honest, it was as much about becoming independent and partying. I'm surprised I passed my bachelor's, because I was out partying and drinking more than I was studying. But, I did apply myself when I needed to for the studies as well. Yeah. But ultimately, that opened the world to travel. I went to Australia in between
Wow.
my bachelor's and master's. And then I sort of done all the other bits we'll kind of get to. So I think that was a big part, was how do I become independent, where I get to choose when I wake up, when I go to bed, where I live, where I study, where I party. That was all a big thing at that sort of 19, 20 years old. And then bringing it into career, I was probably aiming for like a finance job in London because I did economics and then the master's was in marketing. And I applied for a few jobs. I remember around the time it felt a bit discriminatory that I'd got a 2-1, I got a pass in my master's, and yet I wasn't getting interviews in some of those jobs. Looking back, I didn't have my heart in those applications either. So it's hard to discern between the businesses going, oh, he's in a chair, he's got a disability, could he do the sort of level of exertion of working in the city of London? But I also had those questions. I wasn't sure. So I ended up, I think my stepmom found an advert for a job, a charity called Scope, who a lot of people have probably heard of. Most people heard because of the shops on the high streets, but others have heard a bit more about, it's a very big disability charity. And so I got my first job with Scope, and that was more about, can I do Monday to Friday, 9 to 5 in an office? Bearing in mind, this was in about 06, 07. So this is way before the pandemic and working from home became more acceptable. So I kind of got through that next challenge of, all right, I can do Monday to Friday, 9 to 5, and I'm learning to work out how I work in an office, and I got access to work, which is like a government support for people at work. Again, we can delve into that if that's relevant later. But so I think what happened is once I've been at Scope and got used to working, then I was like, wow, what they stand for and the numbers around how many disabled people are, the barriers and the challenges disabled people face. It was the first time, beyond the fact that I'd had the challenges of going to uni or traveling or whatever, like, shit, there's a load of other people that have these challenges. So that's when it lit the fire in my belly to really go out and make change, inverted commas, because that can mean lots of things, and it meant lots of different things over my career after that. But yeah, essentially from Scope onwards, I decided to leave about 2011. And, I had a mortgage in London and I didn't know exactly how I was going to have regular money that I was getting from my salary at Scope. But sometimes you just have a feeling that you need to do something. And I handed my notice in. I gave myself 8 weeks to just work it out. And then, from then on, I started Disability Horizons, started Accomable, did a lot of speaking at conferences, a lot of blogging, a lot of media work, got voted in the Power 100. And so all of that, kind of long story short, built up to start in Purple Goat April 2020, which was a partnership with a mainstream agency. And I think that's an important lesson I learned over those previous 10 years, is that we all try and do it alone, or even within the community, or within, if we go beyond disability, just within an echo chamber. And it's only when we go into like multiple verticals and different networks and we kind of learn from others and collaborate with others, it unlocked the thing that I'd been struggling to unlock for 10 years. So I think that partnership was a big reason Purple Goat flourished off the back of 10, 15 years, a lifetime of overcoming those other personal barriers as well.
Coming back to what you said earlier, I just want to touch on it because it's quite a hot topic. What is your views on remote working? Because there's a lot in the community, outside of the community, that are trying to push people back into offices and back into those spaces. As someone leading a business that is a remote business, what's your view on it as a disabled person? Because I think it's hard, because all that we hear is from the mainstream business owners, the ones that they can just pop into the office. It's nice and easy and it doesn't cause any problems. It's more like the luxury side of it of like, oh, that way I can put a load of washing on, that way I can do all this. What is your view on it as a disabled business owner?
Yeah, I mean, I guess probably the two strands of that, disabled and business owner. As a business owner with Purple Goat, I was ridiculously excited in the lead up to launching Purple Goat that I and the team that would eventually be recruited and employed once we got going would all go in to use the Goat, this other agency I referenced before,
Yep.
the Goat offices. And I'd been watching their vlog in sort of 2019 when I was getting to know them before we started Purple Goat. So when we launched Purple Goat April 2020, we were in lockdown. And so that sort of first year or two of pandemic, we were partly the lockdowns and then the general, I wasn't in a hurry to go to like a busy place indoors,
Yep.
even when some people were all right with it, just because, quite frankly, didn't want to get COVID kind of thing. So that whole bit we remember from 2-3 years ago, I was gutted that I couldn't go and have that officey part of running and growing Purple Goat. So that was like frustrating when we couldn't. But then because we launched in a pandemic and we've recruited that first group of people into the business when it was very like remote, it's obviously been harder to get everyone in the company literally spread across the UK into the same office every day of the week. So I think that as a business owner, but also as a disabled person, the option and the flexibility to be at home is a positive. But I think, and I wonder if it's sort of what I was going to say, what your view is, but for me, when it gets pushed into, we don't need to make transport inclusive or buildings inclusive or work inclusive because disabled people are happy to work at home, that's a problem for me because, like I said, I was excited to be able to go to an office. So I suppose overall my answer is that it's great we've got remote working as a more cultural possibility for whether it's health reasons, culture reasons, other reasons like children, older parents, whatever it might be. But I think having the choice to do both is important. But I'd say, what's your view on it, Charlie?
I think the one thing I'm really passionate about is too many organizations are making it a yes or no question. So it's very much like you have to be in on these days or you have to be in this amount of days, where it should just be a case by case basis. If you want to go in because you feed off the social environment and that's your best space, by all means do that. If it's not your best space, don't do that. I just don't like this whole one size fits all scenario, which we always find ourselves in any context. Really, it's all like, oh, we don't want to label too much, we don't want to do this, we don't do that. It all comes down to you're trying to wedge everyone into this pretty little box, and it doesn't work. And I think that's where I really struggle, because I really enjoy working from home, because I felt that prior to COVID, half of the opportunities I couldn't access because people wouldn't even entertain me because they couldn't adapt the building to what I'd need. Now years later, it's a very different story. I'm a bit more of an older head on my shoulders. I'd be able to argue my case a little bit more. But at the time coming out of school, those opportunities weren't there. So I still hate it that I'd asked for remote working when I was 18 years old, got told, oh no, we don't trust you because you're 18 years old. Pandemic hits and all of a sudden everyone's working from home. And I think that's where I do think I understand why businesses want people back in the offices for the morale aspect and the collaborative working, completely understand it. But I think they're forgetting that if you have the right culture and the right people, that is all possible digitally. Like the amount of Teams calls I end up on, we're just bouncing ideas off of each other, and we're still all sat in our offices at home, but we still have the same environment. I think the only thing you miss out on is that like nuanced information that you like overhear from a colleague having a conversation with another colleague. So you go, oh, that's good to know for future. I think all of it comes down to just giving people the choice. I don't like this like organizations have the choice. I think it should be the employee has the choice of what fits them best. Because I still argue as well that society's not built for people to have families, kids this, that, the other. And there's an argument case to say, oh, that's just life. You've got to adapt and overcome. But the system doesn't work. It doesn't work.
Yeah, no, and it's, when we talk about, disability and social model and barriers, there are very, particularly like with someone like you and I with more mobility, category, segment, whatever label we're saying, there are obviously very real barriers about, like, say, access to transport or buildings or whatever. But when you just talk about inclusion more broadly, and we've had, big, quite rightly so, big conversations the last 2, 3, 4 years, particularly around race and LGBTQ plus, and I think fortunately that's given a bit of space for disability to also get a little bit more involved in that broader conversation. I've always said disability is like the poor cousin of diversity and inclusion. So when you look back at legislation, the gender legislation, the race legislation, sexuality, they all came in before the Disability Discrimination Act, which was 95. So we're going for like a tangent, but I think my broader point is that, there are conversations disability specific. In the end, it's just about inclusion and creating an environment, whether it's a workplace environment or a home environment or a, leisure, travel environment, whatever it is, that enables people to live the life they want to in the way they want to. And that sometimes might sound a bit like a utopia pipe dream, but actually with the technologies we've got, it's more doable than ever. And like, so my point about the GOAT offices, we are now, I know COVID's a little bit back in the news again, but, broadly speaking, the world's a lot more opened up and people are a lot more out and about. Like, so we are, as Purple Goat, doing more in person, whether it's socials or having a bit more time in the office in London. But like, I couldn't go, I live in Cambridgeshire, I couldn't go to an office Monday to Friday, 9 to 5. Probably if it was in the same town, I would struggle more now with my physical energy limitations than when I was starting at Scope. I was like 22, 23, I'm 40 now. Like with my SMA, there's a progressive nature. So I'd struggle doing that locally. I definitely couldn't commute to London 5 days a week. So as you say, it's a choice. It's like, if I want to go into the office, I can go because I can get on the train, I can go to the office, it's all wheelchair accessible. But I can also just be at home and chatting like we are here with videos and mics and all that. And I think that's good that conversation is beyond disability, because in that way we're not doing pigeonholes and labels. We're just saying, how do we give people what they need just to be fulfilled and healthy? But I think from a business point of view, you sort of said about the trust thing. Like, I know that if someone's going to take the piss, it's going to come out just because of general objectives and performance. Like it's just obvious if someone's not doing any work at all. But micromanaging and like spying and some of the things you hear some of the brands or businesses doing with remote work, like, it's paranoia and it's quite disrespectful to the employees, because people that care about their career and their job and all that, they're going to just crack on and do it in their own rhythm and their own ways. And it's more about output quite often than the exact method that everyone has a different way of doing it.
And I think that's something we can take from the education system. The one thing we always bang on about is people learn and interpret information differently. I will tell you, hand on heart, written information is not the way forward for me. But stick it in an audio book or stick it in like someone telling me what to do, and I'm like, oh yeah, I get what you mean. It's just that ability to adapt and overcome. And coming back to what we said earlier, of like, I'm a prime example of the issues around remote working causing a problem and causing a career sort of hiccup, if you like, of basically when I left school, I wanted to go into marketing. And the main reason I didn't go into marketing was I'd applied for too many jobs that said no because of access requirements, or everyone was telling me to go work in London. And my biggest fear was what happens if a train stops at a station that I can't get off at, or I get forgotten. I don't want to deal with that anxiety every day.
It's quite similar to my sort of journey out of uni then, really, isn't it?
Yeah. And
Yeah.
it still happens today. That's the crazy thing.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
like people want to work for the big firms. They want to go up London. They want to enjoy that culture. But most of us, yes, it's accessible to an extent, but they're like, it happened to me on Friday. I got to the station. They're like, no, you can't get on this train. But they'd sent me to 3 separate platforms that were the wrong platforms. So it wasn't my fault I'd missed the train. But yeah, I think that's the other thing. It's just that ability to be flexible. And as you say, just trusting. Like, this whole thing of someone messaging, oh, I'm really sorry, I need to pop out for 5 minutes. That shouldn't be an issue. It's like,
No.
yeah, that's fine. Go do it. Like, I think the other thing I've had recently is this. I had someone say to me before, like, people should be able to separate their work and home life. Whereas I'm a believer of, like, that's not possible. Like, if you've got a sick family member and you're asked to just, oh yeah, forget that, leave that at the door.
Mm-hmm.
How does that work?
Yeah.
I think
it's not reality, is it?
No, I just think a lot of the time when we talk about business, and this is talking very broadly, like there are some great ones out there, and I know you don't have the same belief systems, Martyn, but like it just seems they're so unflexible and almost they lose all like personal skills. Like,
Yeah.
I don't know. I mean, that's me making. I'm sort of making assumptions because there's very few interactions I've had, but that's how it seems when you talk of business and the big hitters, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and I think some of the big hitters obviously did make changes because of the pandemic, because the whole mainstream society needed those accommodations and adjustments rather than not only disabled people, but that more of a minority that, as you say, maybe you've got, someone that's an older parent or a young child or all the other, like that they actually add up to quite a few people in reality, but they're not seen as like enough people to warrant mass scale changes. Whereas I think because everyone had to stay home in the lockdowns, those big hitters, as you call them, had to adapt. And then I think we're seeing it going back a bit. I don't know
That's
data,
my biggest
but
fear.
Little bits in the news are even like Zoom, which was the big kind of winner of the working at home era. Apparently they've asked their staff to come back and work in the office, which is quite an ironic one. So yeah, I think that is a bit of a worry and a problem particularly for disabled people, that working from home is preferable and better for whatever reason that might be.
I think it's also like people not willing to just like expand their view. Like a lot of people, they want it to go back to what it was. And like I'm a very much a believer of like it's never going to go. Nothing ever goes back to what it was, because if you're not moving forward, what's the point?
Yeah.
So I
think to your point about progress, you touched on education, and we've touched a lot on sort of work in a more, I guess, the big hitters or like the more mainstream world of work. And obviously, as 2 disabled guys, you and I have got those, the mobility bit. Like if the trains don't play ball, then that can make getting to and from work if you were commuting all the time to London. So there's a very specific part that you and I have always had to think about. But when you look at the bigger trend, I think, because of technology, really, there is more possibility to disrupt and innovate education and the world of work. And I think where people, whether disabled or not, aren't getting on with those traditional ways, there are people that maybe homeschool their kids more, or that sort of vibe. And I think a big one, you and I get stuck into is that sort of entrepreneurship. Like the reason I ended up becoming an entrepreneur, it's partly a way, a vehicle to make change within that bigger mission of disability inclusion. But it also suited me better personally. And so I guess my point is that when the traditional mainstream way doesn't work for people, there's more opportunity to just build your own path. And that's not just disabled people, but I think there is a stat that like 25% of small businesses in the UK have a disabled like founder, entrepreneur. So yeah, I think there's a lot around the bit about societal barriers and the bit about health considerations that create that bit maverick, renegade, sort of build your own path, but it's not because all disabled people are just renegades or mavericks. It's actually a kind of necessity because the other way doesn't work for us.
That's exactly what I was going to say. A lot of disabled people feel forced into it, because particularly, I mean, I can't speak on personal experience, but from speaking to people, particularly people in the chronically ill space, they're constantly saying that they have to build their own paths because employers aren't as flexible and aren't as lenient with them. But as a closing point, I want to bring it back to asking a question that I think a lot of people wonder, and I wonder it myself. As a business owner, is it cheaper to have staff working from home? I know obviously you've got the added stuff of you've got the goat offices and everything there, but does it actually work out cheaper from a financial perspective?
I mean, firstly, bluntly, yeah. I mean, like a cost of office for a growing team is going to have a bigger cost. I mean, the opposite side is because we don't have an office, we do a lot more social events. So we then cover people's transport and food and drink. And so I would still probably, guesstimate that it would still not be as much as having particularly like a London office space and all that.
Yeah.
But I also just want to be clear that that's not ever been a reason or a driver for it. No. It's sort of more about people being all over the country, just not practical to get them in the same office. But yeah, the pure simple answer to the financial question is it is, especially, and also just another bit of clarity is we're, about 20 people we're employing at Purple Goat.
Yeah.
But if you're talking about 100 people, 500,000, 10,000, then obviously the costs are going to go way up around real estate of office space to have enough room for that kind of number of people. So sort of as a business owner, I can answer as Purple Goat, but that isn't, there's so many variables as well. Yeah.
But I think also the key point there, though, is that Purple Goat's a very socially forward company. So it wasn't something where I thought that would have been a consideration. It's more to point out to other organizations particularly the more old school way of thinking companies, of pointing out that actually there are some business benefits to having a remote staff members.
Yeah, and I guess if someone's making that general judgment, like a larger business in London, I do believe there's a business benefit of having people in person sometimes. Mm-hmm. And so I think that's where you're going to see hybrid, that there may be not larger offices that cater for every employee every day of the working week. But I do think a lot of businesses need that hub for creative meetings and client meetings, that there are still things that I would rather go to London and do because it's going to be a much more rich experience than doing a Teams call. So as always in life, it's not black or white. There is nuance, there's grey areas. But I do take your point. There is, if you're just number crunching, then if businesses sort of even downsize, to my point, the size of their office, then they're gonna see a financial benefit to that. I would imagine, because the infrastructure of someone working at home is less. And then there's other things we do pay a bit of money for people to have adjustments at home to make sure they're kind of comfortable with the setup, like the cost of a chair or a desk. And so there's some costs about helping employees be safe and comfortable at home as well. But I think your point's true. I just wanted to add the nuance to it.
I mean, I probably sound like a negative ninny. I'm not hell-bent against going into the office. I think it's more to highlight to businesses the reasons why a lot of the time, particularly in the disability space, they feel that going backwards is a painful experience, because then some people's livelihoods are in question, because you're going to be like, oh, well, if I'm being forced into the office, but we've been working from home for 3 years, do I now need to go and find a new job? And that's the bit where I do get a bit wary from the, like I say, from the social side and the like collaborative thinking side. There's definitely something to be said about going into an office, because there's the other added nuance of people's body language. Like you can't really get that from a Teams call. It just doesn't work. So
I think like if there's someone that literally just can't, go out the house or get to an office, like it doesn't even matter whether it's more financially better for the business or not. Like there are laws and there's moral responsibility to just be a good person and a good employer for people. So I think you're right to bring the financial element in, because as we know, businesses, money talks, right? So I think there's definitely some arguments around the finances, but I think, even if it doesn't mean it's better financially, it's about, and you could even look at like productivity, right? So if you've got this absolute genius within some kind of role for a business, but they can't get to the office, they're adding so much value to your business from home. So if even financially, you can look at it in a kind of value or a productivity way as well.
I think as well, there's that added thing of, I argue that people actually work harder at home. Like I'll say I do. I can't now. I'm the worst. I can't stand being in an office purely because I'm like, too much talking. Everyone shut up.
I have to be honest, my days in the office are more social. Like there'll be a bit of a meeting that was nice in terms of the business. Like, and it's all business because relationships matter in business. But I totally agree with you. Like if I've got a load of emails or some kind of strategy document, some kind of document, like that ain't going to get done in the office because I am just talking to people all day long in the office.
It's really interesting because we used to be able to just zone that stuff out.
Yeah.
But now we can't.
Yeah. So I remember at Scope, I always got told off for talking too much in the office.
Oh, yeah, I did that.
Then. So it's a thing I've always, and even at school, like I've never been naughty, like kid, like school-wise, I've never been a naughty kid. But I got told off just because I talk too much, to be honest.
There's a lot of similarities between me and Martyn when it comes to that. Coming on to Purple Goat a bit more, how did you go about pitching that idea? I know it wasn't just you, but how did that idea all come about of, right, we're gonna go to Goat and we're gonna say, how about this as a proposal?
Yeah, so I mentioned briefly earlier Horizons and Accomable. So Disability Horizons was basically it was a magazine, but it was utilising more like digital tools that hadn't been used by the existing magazines. And I mean, now the old school mags now use like bloggy, digitally, social media-y tools. But about sort of 2010, 2011, they were starting to use a bit online, but Shrin's a friend of mine with SMA, and we co-founded Horizons and we co-founded Accomable. So we just had the idea that it was a magazine by disabled people for disabled people. So the actual articles were quite spicy for the time. And I mean, even now, I know you've done a lot that tackles stigma and relationships and sex, and you've been innovative doing it the last 2 to 3 years because it shows how little things really moved on. But that was one of the things we did in 2010, 2011 that wasn't really being done before. And so the content was good, the reach, the readership was good. We're sort of talking pre-Instagram here, so there wasn't that Instagram, TikTok culture, or whether you look at it as a social thing or a business thing, that just didn't exist. And the business model was meant to be advertising. So we'd sell to like more disability brands like wheelchair, car adaptation type companies.
Yeah.
But it never quite worked. And, we tried different things. And then we thought, we've got great content and we've got this really big engaged community, like email list, lots of SEO juice. But we sort of, kind of got to the point of it's not a business at the moment. So I think then that was where Accomable was like, what product could we do for the community on Horizons? And that was, well, what if we vet accommodation and then make that, as a new product?
Yeah.
So that was probably 2016. I'm sort of losing exactly all the years that everything happens. But that, from a business point, that was fun because that was like social enterprise grant, angel investment, tech. Like, we were dreaming of Y Combinator. Have you heard of Y Combinator before?
No.
So they invest in startups in California, like San
Wow.
Francisco.
Yeah.
So we were like, I think we even went on a holiday and did San Fran to Vegas to LA, and me and Shrim were like, we're going to be back here one day with our $1 billion startup and all that kind of aspiration. And so there were challenges, I suppose, just like any tech startup has around capital, funding, investment. But it was also like the variables and the data about what access needs disabled people had and what accommodation was available and what facilities they had to then match if, that cottage in Norfolk suitable for me or for you or someone with a different disability. So anyway, the long and the short was it grew quite well, but we couldn't grow it all the way without like a big amount of investment or be acquired. And so Shrin led on the acquisition more than I did. He was sort of more like tech kind of product guy, and I've always been more community marketing guy. And ultimately Airbnb bought the business. So when you look on Airbnb, Accomable is no more, but all the knowledge we built up, the filters and all that sort of stuff is on Airbnb when you look at the filters now. And I think by their own admission, they've still got more work to do, because even with the right product, the right filter, you're relying on the accommodation provider or the supply side to have the trustworthy, reliable data for the disabled person to know that it's going to be. So I appreciate this all sounds a bit tangential to your Purple Goat question, but it was all a lot of learning and a lot of progress. But I came back to Horizons after that acquisition and I was like, right, there's got to be a way to still grow this and still have a proper business model. And I started going on some like startup incubators, and I got some free coaching at Cambridge Uni, just down the road from where I live. And I went to this session, and it say like April-ish 2019. And the guy just said to me, look, instead of trying to have the platform as Horizons, where that has like almost like all disabled people coming to one website, now the world had moved on and there was Instagram and I don't know if do you know when TikTok came out? Can you remember what year?
No, I remember I started getting involved in it in COVID, so like 2019. I think it was around 2018, I think.
So it was probably just starting to pop, but essentially the rise of influencer, inverted commas, because that word's got its own like thing going on we can touch on. But so the guy just said to me, this coaching session was like, what if you create more like an agency that's in the middle, and then also not go into the disability brands, but go into the large like mainstream brands and get their marketing spend on the basis that there's a lot of disabled people, which I kind of I intimated it in my scope thing earlier. But as you probably know, but some of the listeners, it's like 1.3 billion people globally. It's an $8 trillion annual global market. So it was literally that in a nutshell, was what if there's a new agency that connects mainstream brands' marketing budgets with the underserved, underrepresented, disabled consumer base. And then the influencers, you're not going to like disabilityhorizons.com, but you can activate 5, 10, 20, 50, whatever influencers with a disability, depending on the brand and the product and the campaign, to kind of join those dots. So the light bulb went on, as you can imagine. But I'd never run an agency or a marketing like agency. So I went home, I looked on LinkedIn at influencer agencies, and I found the GOAT. And I reached out. I asked, I think I got hold of Harry, one of the founders. He agreed to have a phone call. I then said I could come and do a talk for free, like a lunch and learn for their staff. And the whole while it was more like, well, Horizons could start to do this kind of idea. And then the more it went through getting to know Goat, I eventually spoke to Aaron, who was like, kind of saw the bigger business side of it all. I think Harry saw the Goat should be working with more disabled influencers, which is awesome. But like, there's still sensitivities around having that disabled founder and like by the community for the community vibe. And I think Aaron saw that as well. So February 2020, I'm on a phone call with Aaron in Tenerife, and I'm just still like trying to get into their client base, you know, like how can I just get in front of like Meta or Nike or whatever it might be. And then Aaron was like, I'll tell you what we're going to do. We're going to do a joint venture. Oh, Martyn, I'll have 51% and then Go 49%. And then we came up with the name and we launched it in the April. So I think it's important to see how long that took, right? How many different things happened and a lot of trial and error and all that. But it probably took me nearly a year from meeting the Goat guys to then launching a business with them.
But I would say that's short.
Everyone else is probably right,
everyone else is probably like, oh, that's a long time. I'm like, I would anticipate you'd be like it'd be like that thing of like you have to chip away. You have to like make them think it's their idea, make them think it's a good idea.
Yeah, and in a way it kind of was a bit of both, right? Because I know I could see the vision and knew what it could be, but I also needed their experience and knowledge and capability of like, how do you, I mean, you're on the other side of this, right? But like, how do you work with an influencer? Like, how do you find influencers? And so that bit was really important and helpful from them. And also, how do you sell to a brand? Like, what makes a brand spend 50 grand on a marketing campaign? Because, you know, honestly, Charlie, like when I was at Horizons, 500 quid for like an ad banner or a sponsored post felt like the most money in the world when we were doing that. And so I've been on a real journey from like really struggling to get brands to spend money on this stuff to suddenly getting like big, you know, billings coming in, but then having to recruit and hire talent in different parts and then people managing. I mean, it's my head sort of the last 2-3 years has been so much growth, but it's phenomenal that it's all worked as well.
How does it go getting in front of those bigger brands? Like, I think everyone listening, everyone ever wants to know, how did those conversations happen? Of like, right, we're going to jump into this, we're going to spend X amount of money, and this is what we're going to give you in return for that. How do those conversations go?
Yeah, we're sort of bridging the two, but just one little thing from what we were saying before, that the reason I said that year seems long is because I wanted to just do it in a day, right? So for me, a year felt like an eternity, right? But you're right, looking back, a year's not that much to actually get to know a group of new people. And so it needed to take that time because I got to know Harry and Aaron and Nick and other people, and they got to know me. And the reason that's relevant to your question is that, okay, so I had more chance to get to know people at bigger brands because Go had some of those relationships. But actually, I also got brands to have a call with me just by doing like emails or LinkedIn outreach. But I was just more confident in what I was selling. So it wasn't only because they had the network, it was partly my own self-belief and my own confidence that I could actually just get in front and talk to someone. But then really in the end, I guess knowing what the sell is important. But in the end, it's just a person, right? Like there's someone working at that brand, the way you're working, where you work and I work where I work. And we all get up in the morning and, you know, we all have family. And so there is that like business pitching bit, which I'd already got experience of, and I learned a lot from Go. But in the end, it's just about people and building relationships, to be honest.
Do you ever, I mean, it's a bit of a buzzword, so I apologize, but do you ever get imposter syndrome?
Yeah, I definitely do. I'm sort of thinking because if I'm honest, there were times in the past I felt invincible. Like literally, when I went to Australia, when we did Accomable, like I did a lot of TV, I presented on BBC stuff. Like none of that felt like imposter. But I think if I'm really, and that was where I paused when you asked the question, I was trying to think what environment causes that more. So there are things I can just do and they might seem scary to someone else. And I'm like, this is just easy and awesome.
Yeah.
But I think so I felt like it was a struggle to earn a half decent living for a long while. So there was a lot of like, a bit of speaking money, like if I did a conference and some like social media clients. But from leaving Scope 2011 till Purple Goat, I was like hand to mouth every month. I was like eking out a living. And as a kind of reference before, that was a bit attached to self-belief and self-esteem and confidence. So it's sort of like the bit that I probably truly struggled with for 10 years was, can a disabled person earn a good amount of money?
Yeah,
can a disabled person start a business that's successful in a non-disabled world? And I think without realizing that was going on deeper in my psyche, I think that was the imposter that I felt at points when I was growing Purple Goat.
I think you've hit the nail on the head, and you hit like quite a personal chord with me as well. Of like, I think that's probably where I would say mine comes from, is that whole thing of, apart from you, not to stroke your ego, I don't know anyone in the entrepreneurial space that has hit the big time. Like, it's really hard. Like, that sounds really horrible. So I can imagine there's people I just haven't come across yet. But in terms of like, whenever we talk of entrepreneurship and we talk the big businesses, none of them have got now this is probably going to get me cancelled, obvious disabilities. Like there's a lot like out there now there's a lot of autistic businessmen, ADHD, a lot in the neurodiverse community, but out there in terms of just, you're in a wheelchair, that's dead obvious. There isn't a lot out there.
Yeah, no, I agree. And I think we're both in that, we're totally in agreement of all of the DEI strands and conversations. And the same way that brands I talk to haven't done anything with disability because they're just scared of getting it wrong.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of people are feeling that way when having conversations around DEI because of that. And answer to your point there, like you're speaking about almost hidden and unhidden disabilities, aren't you? It's like there probably are successful people that haven't, shall we say, disclosed or shared that they have a disability, and there's no pressure or reason for them to do so.
Yeah.
But at the same time, when someone has a disability and you look ahead for someone 5 years, 10 years further down the road for inspiration, for role models, I agree. Like, I can't recollect, as you sort of say, like, outwardly, obviously disabled people that have, like kind of grown businesses. I mean, as I said earlier, like we're still relatively small at Purple Goat. So we're not like employing thousands of people, but within the disability community, I guess the impact and the success is more that we're in the marketing world in a non-disabled world. And I think that's what I spoke to earlier. I was in an echo chamber. We're all often in a disability echo chamber. And when we try to go to government to change policy or business to change whatever elements like employment or marketing or the other parts, like that's when the imposter syndrome can kick in because we've not got a map or a role model of many people that have done that before. But I know that, there's still loads more to do at Purple Goat, and I'm like, can't wait to see where we go in the next 3 years. And I'm also getting a little bit of invitations now to speak as a disabled entrepreneur. And it excites me because I wish I had someone when I was 15, 20, 25 that just literally doesn't matter what they did or what their disability was, just to show me what was possible. But I do think there are more role models now, not maybe so much entrepreneurship, but definitely Instagrammer influencer, TikTok influencer. There's so much more that kind of media role models. And there's like people writing in BBC, Guardian. So I think we are getting better representation the last 10 years in all parts of society, but it feels like entrepreneurship and business is a bit late to the party.
Yeah, I feel like for me, like I've had many conversations with you because you are the touch point I have of like almost you've done a lot of the stuff. I'm like, oh, I want to know about this. So like one of the things is like I always think about like acquisition you spoke about earlier. And I'm like, there aren't really many people that have, I mean, disability doesn't change how that happens. Like it's just, that's how it works. But in terms of like someone you're able to relate to and ask those questions to without feeling like the idiot in the room, if that makes sense. And I know that everyone says in like the like entrepreneur space, like be the idiot in the room because that's how you learn. But then it's about being comfortable being the idiot in the room. I think those are two very different things.
Yeah, like you said, and I get like it's partly the humorous side of being the idiot in the room. And as you say, the lesson as well is about being open to failure and curious and all that good stuff as well. But I think that like say you go through a business later in life and there's an acquisition, I'm not going to be able to like show you how to do it because it's going to be a different whole set of different circumstances. Yeah. So you're going to have to work out a load of unknowns regardless of knowing someone like me, and it's possible. And I guess the metaphor, I think there was a long while that the 1 minute mile, there's a whole like story that I can't remember what year the guy was at the Bannister in like 60s or something.
Yeah, and it was essentially
he ran the mile in a minute, under a minute. Then loads of people did it. So I think it's just seeing is believing, I think, is the power.
That's exactly what I was going to say. That whole story does illustrate that seeing, believing, because it's that whole thing of like, because no one had done it, they don't think it's possible. But then as soon as someone does it, everyone does it. But yeah, it's I think from talking, it's just that whole having someone to relate to, even if you don't get to speak to them or they're not going to go on the same journey you do. It's like that whole, it's almost like a comfort blanket. It's probably the best way I would describe it. It's like, it's just someone to be like, okay, I am rolling in the right direction. And that's the thing. Coming back to Purple Goat a little bit, what was the biggest challenge when starting Purple Goat? Like, what was the biggest lesson that you learned?
Yeah, when I look back, it all pretty much played out how you would have wanted it to and dreamt it could have. So looking back, the broad kind of got more clients, so we got more revenue, so we could take on more staff, so then we could do more clients. And so that virtuous cycle was played out a bit, I don't say textbook, but like, it worked exactly as I would have wanted it to. But there's been some other curveballs on the road. So like one thing was, this story more, but for people listening, watching, Chris was a guy I was good friends with. He was very involved in Disability Horizons when it sort of almost not morphed, because Horizons carried on as a mag, but like that bit I told you about where I sort of worked out how to start an influencer agency. So Chris was the next person at Purple Goat, and he passed away December 21, and it was very sudden, and just obviously lost a dear friend, and everyone working at Purple Goat lost a dear colleague. And so that, anyone knows in life when you lose someone close to you, it's a bit of a kick in the gut, and there's a process to grieve. But he was also very important at Purple Goat, just day-to-day running. And there was, and so I guess before I say the next bit, I also I got COVID and I was a bit unwell with it. But it was the same time that Chris died. And I'd also just completely flogged my body and my mind for like a year and a half getting the thing going. So fortunately, when I was just had to have a bit of time out to just look after my health, there was enough people in the business that had enough experience / confidence to just keep it going.
Yeah.
The blessing, or even the lesson to your question, is that you can't do it all on your own, and you do need a team, and you have to let go of the reins, and you have to delegate, and you have to trust people. And however much I knew that from all my binging of like books and podcasts from entrepreneurs, it was a hard thing the thing that I'd started as me with Go, and then it was like 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 people. It was almost like I had to just get knocked down for a couple of weeks to then go, oh, actually, they were coping fine without me.
Yeah.
So that was like a lesson that was really hard to go through. And even then, it kind of knocked my confidence for a while, because I was like, so where is my limit? I don't want to burn out again. So there was a few months that I got a bit in my head about all this. But I think overall the lesson was you got to put your health first, probably most of all. And when you're starting a business, that's hard. But yeah, you've also got to have good people around you and trust them. So there's a few little nuggets amongst that anecdote.
I think as well, like you've touched on there, like the whole burnout thing, and like that finding that balance is really hard, because you got on one hand, like me and Martyn are very similar, listen to loads of entrepreneurial books, entrepreneurial podcasts, and it's always like essentially you got the one side of the camp going, nope, get the appropriate rest up, like you're no good to anyone if you don't rest. And you got the other ones that just like do it till you die. Yeah. And
maybe that's a bit about the role modeling of a disabled entrepreneur, because when our role models, I'm sure mine and yours are similar people, if not similar messages, there is that hustle, get up at 5 a.m., you know, you've got your 9 to 5 and your 5 to 9, and, you know, and I think, and I don't want to fall into that, but I think some of that's true. I think there are times I've really worked way too much, but it got me part of that got me where I am. So I can't just pretend that isn't important, because it is. But we're allowed to hold paradoxes and contradictions. And so when you're feeling capable to work hard, you don't stop just because someone's saying, watch your health. But it's more the self-awareness that when you know you're burning out or you're close to burnout, then the other point is very, 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 very important to actually go, this isn't worth getting ill and all the rest of it. So, yeah, it's quite paradoxical, these types of conversations, but it is both.
Yeah, and I think one example I would give is like I've gone through, I brought it up quite a few times on the podcast, I went through quite a negative experience working for a startup, and then that had a knock-on effect on my mental health. So then that, I almost got the like slap round the face lesson before I started getting really involved in the entrepreneurial space, social media space, and starting to like build my projects and build my different things going on. So like I kind of got the lesson before I'd even started. So my journey is really weird, because I'm hyper aware of like, am I doing okay? Is my mental health okay? Is my anxiety okay? Is everything all good? So then I'm almost like, like you say, it's that whole thing of like, am I pushing hard enough, or is this the whole chip on the shoulder issue coming in? And I think it's so much of just a balancing game. As you say, like, it's that whole finding the right mix. If you can work late, work late. If you're feeling good and you're on a roll, go for it. If you're not, probably pull back. But I just want to add an anecdotal point to that whole get up at 5 a.m. One side point, as someone who's got a disability, one thing that happens then is you sit there and go, right, I want to get up at 5 a.m., but if there's something you need assistance with and you can't do it yourself, then it gets very tricky. Like, for example, I would get up at 5 a.m., but I'd need someone to come and put my shoes on. Yeah. So then I'd have to wake someone else up to be like, no, I want to be productive. You've got to be productive.
Yeah. That's so true. There's quite a few things thrown off from my head here, because I guess what I was going to add before was just around the team like I also knew all along what my strengths and weaknesses were. But when it was only me, I had to do all of the stuff. But the more the team grew, I now double down on the bits I love and I'm good at. And that's better for Purple Go, better for the like bigger mission. So just a little kind of general thought that, like I'm not, it's funny, I did a lot with spreadsheets. I did A-level maths. I did a lot of stuff in economics with spreadsheets, but I don't like spreadsheets. Like I just struggle. Like I just, I could blame my disability, but I think it's just a personal thing. I just don't like being in spreadsheets. But there are lots of, there are people that have to use spreadsheets in the job that maybe don't love them, but it's just, that has to be done.
Yeah.
But there are, like, just as a more general point, there are people that like hate, say, finances, and there are people that just always wanted to be an accountant. So I guess another lesson was that the world's so diverse, not in the DEI, but just general ways. Like people have different skills, different interests, different passions. And when you harness all that into a business, you get much better synergy and output because you've got like idea generation and you've got people leaning into their strengths. So that was like definitely something there. But your point about the 5 a.m. and, how someone might have to come then give you a hand. One thing I've definitely learned about is when I am a bit awake at night thinking of a business idea or up earlier, productivity doesn't have to be at the laptop or like a physicality. It can just be that thinking time or it could be like reading or listening to something. But I've sort of learned that, because as I got a bit older, like doing like a couple of days travel is probably a bit harder than it used to be. So I might spread out how many days I'm out and about. And also after that year and a half of starting Purple Goat, being on laptops got really like burnout really was a partly around doing video calls at 8 a.m. to 8 p.m. So again, I found that like balance of trying not to be on video calls as much. But the reason I struggled was I felt guilty that I wasn't being productive. But I realized that I am being productive, even if I go for a walk with the dog or I'm like just giving myself a different activity, because often that's when the ideas come or you're just kind of ruminating on something. And I think for disabled people in particular, that's quite important to not feel guilty when we can't do stuff or how we do stuff. But we are actually very creative and valuable and productive in those moments of just thinking about cool ideas as well.
Yeah, I mean, one thing that Gina will always say is I tend to go. So for those that don't know, I spent a lot of my teen years swimming. So like swimming is very much an autopilot thing for me. Like I can go in the zone and like I don't even realize I'm doing it. So then that means that oftentimes I'll get out the pool and I'm like, oh, I've got like 6 ideas. I need to write these down.
Yeah.
Gina's like, you just went to the gym. Like, what happened? And I'm like, but I want to think we could do this. We could do this. We could.
Yeah.
And it is just all about, as you say, I think that's the whole thing of like imaging of like whenever you get into the entrepreneurial space, it's all like, you must be at your laptop, you must be doing this, you must be working. Whereas like, to be honest, 90% of the work I do is done from my phone because I can't be bothered. And this makes me sound really lazy. It all comes down to I can't be bothered to sort my laptop out, plug it all in, get everything set up. Whereas I can just pick my phone up and go.
Yeah, no, exactly. And as I said, there are jobs where like, even to my video call thing, there's an element about growing a team and being able to delegate that. I don't want to call it luck because it was by design and it took a lot of effort to get it there. But I'm at a point now where lots of Purple Goat runs really well without my having to be on it all day, every day. And I generally am because I love it and I choose to be. But I guess just speaking to that entrepreneurship topic, that is something about when people, maybe haven't got an 8-hour that sort of day in their tank, but when you're clever at designing a business that you can automate elements with technology or you can employ people in terms of other, things that need to be done, there's something very powerful about, entrepreneurship as a lifestyle design for a business as well.
Yeah, definitely. And I think it's just about how you frame your day. It's like you say, it's like just knowing what you're capable of and knowing where you're bound. It's hard to know where your boundary is, but I think people have a rough guesstimate of where it needs to be, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think so.
Completely separate point. I'm really intrigued to ask you this question. As someone that's like at the top of the social tree, I suppose. I mean, I might be bigging you up a little bit too much, Martyn.
I'll take it.
But what's your view working in the social space with cancel culture? And I feel like that's a big thing, particularly in the disabled community, because it's something me and yourself have conversations with all the time of how can we bring the conversation of disability in without people being fearful? Because there's almost like it can feel like a very much a minefield scenario of, oh, I don't want to do this. I want to do this. I don't want to say this because this might mean this, and so on.
Yeah, I hear you. I think so. I generally do like reading about biographies and history, and just as a personal passion, not only just for work, but somewhere in the middle, like between work and general interest. When I've read a lot about civil rights movement in general, beyond disability, and specifically disability rights, you've always needed that, I don't want to use the word aggressive, but that more, I guess, activist, but like very sort of like physical, sit downs and like blocking the buses in London. Because I think activism doesn't have to mean that. But for the purposes of what we're discussing here, you've always needed that sort of civil disturbance, because without it, no one knows you exist. No one's listening to you. Like whatever your requests, and you're going to be all polite and lovely, no one gives a shit, basically. So you need that civil disobedient activism to get to be heard and to be seen.
Yeah.
But then very often it's not been, and I'm sure there'll be, sort of things that break this rule. But like as a general, they're not the same people that would then go into government and draft the actual legislation with government. So that there will be people in both camps, but there's also two separate parts to it. And I think, to your point, it's easy, like whether we're in the sort of more angrier cancel culture camp or the more pragmatic, let's hold the hand of the brand to help them move forward.
Yep.
You actually need both in reality. And I think that's my view on it. Does that make sense where I'm coming from?
Yeah, it's an interesting perspective. I've never thought about it in that context. So I think the guys that listen to this podcast regularly are probably sick of me banging on about my biggest fear is that everyone that is a bit more in the cancel culture space, sort of like wanting to be very screamy, very shouty, then makes it feel very attacked. Like for me, it just I think it makes the able-bodied community or the wider community feel like they can never do right. And I feel like even as someone in terms of dealing with other communities that aren't the one that I'm in, it does come across like that in other communities as well. It's almost like you constantly, and I must admit that does come down to my generation being a little bit more socially aware. We're automatically thinking, okay, how's that going to come across? But as a general rule of thumb, I think everyone's just constantly worried that someone's going to say the wrong thing. And that's a big fear of mine for having those more difficult conversations and those more challenging scenarios. Like, as you say, now I'm thinking about it, I'm like, actually, yeah, a combination of both does kind of work. It's kind of like a good cop, bad cop role, I suppose.
Yeah. And I think that the people in that more aggressive camp, there still should be, like, almost want to say etiquette, or you can be an activist and you can hold power to account and you can call out things that are wrong in a more like rowdy way, but and still within certain kind of social customs and social norms.
Yeah.
So I think there's probably a spectrum there and some kind of gradient. And I think there's always a small minority that almost go a bit too far. And I'm with you where that just starts to feel uneasy because the people they're shouting at are just not going to want to come near the topic because they're just so scared. But I guess I'm kind of to my previous point, if there was no one holding, power inverted commas to account, the people that, and I think Purple Goat, we are more that we speak to the brands and we're truly there to help them to understand the barriers, understand the opportunity from a business point, and be their friend to like go on that journey.
Yeah.
And that's right for Purple Goat to be that.
Yeah.
But I also feel that if there was never any calling out of wrong going on, then it would be harder for Purple Goat to get the ear of the brand in the first place.
Yeah, I mean, as well, I think for me, I sit and think, say it's that whole thing of finding the right middle ground because, prime example, throughout this conversation, there's been odd points where I've lost my train of thought or can't find the word that I necessarily want. And I think that's something that people miss when it comes to, particularly in the disability space. Sometimes things can just come across the wrong way or someone's used the wrong word because that's like the first word they've put their hand on. Like you saw it with me of going, I went to say something and then got to go, oh, I've got to put this disclaimer here of like, I'm sorry if I get cancelled.
Yeah.
That's something that happens on a regular basis with the wider community because they're like, this is the only word I know to reference this thing.
Yeah.
I know it's not the right word, but I don't know what the right word is.
And again, I guess when you speak to cancel culture, like someone that makes a mistake accidentally and innocently, then losing their job or like their company going under, I think that extremity feels very unfair and counterproductive.
Yeah.
So again, it's paradoxes, it's contradictions, it's nuances as well. But people having an awareness that their words can hurt or offend, and just learning and being curious. And if we've all done it, we've all said something that inadvertently caused offense, to just say I'm sorry and I'll learn now and I'll know not to do that. That probably isn't cancel culture, but that is what should be the way forward. I think.
Completely agree. It's like mistakes is how we progress. Like
entrepreneurship, like failure is the way to progress. Like I said about how many things failed at Horizons and how many, I didn't mention it, but how many people we spoke to invest in Accomable, and you could say them saying no was failure. And like, so not just in the context of the sort of social cancel culture, but just in business. Like if you're not failing, you're not trying something new. So you're not really progressing. So it's kind of, it's almost, to have a culture where it's okay to fail should be good. And I think that's probably, I imagine, the main bit of the kind of agreement we're having on where cancel culture is bad is it prohibits failure and or prohibits people trying to progress forward. And that has to be bad for society as a whole.
A really random question. It popped into my head and I thought, actually, that's an interesting one. When you went through like all the funding rounds that you've gone through and trying to get investment, did it ever feel, obviously being a disability focused entrepreneur, is it hard to separate that whole thing of like, oh, is this because I'm disabled? Now that sounds really like, woe is me. And I don't mean, what I mean is like, there's always, maybe it's just me, but there's always that little voice in the back of my head of like, is it this? And normally I have to squash it because it's nothing to do with it at all. But I just wondered whether you had any of that.
So I feel like overall, not because I'm disabled. And by that, I feel like if I had an idea for a business that wasn't about disability, I feel that more people would have said yes to invest in it. So there may have been some people that didn't invest in me because I'm in a wheelchair and they think can he do the biz?
Do this, yeah.
You know, but I
Yeah.
feel like the world's moved on enough that if they understood and got to know me like Aaron did, there wasn't like, oh, he's disabled, so we can't do that. There's maybe, there's hopefully a compassionate awareness that you might do it a bit differently. And, midwinter, I'm not as energetic as I am midsummer. But I don't think that would have been the be all and end all for an investment. The bit that I believe has been harder in my career of those types of things, whether it's like market and budget from brands or like funding startups, is because the product is for the disabled marketplace, and people just don't. There's so much stigma and stereotype about, historically disability meant institution, disability meant charity, and so educating the business case is taking a while. But I also think through what you sort of mentioned, you know me more than others, but there are other disabled entrepreneurs doing good stuff, but particularly more recently, like 5 years ago, you're probably hard pressed, but there is a lot more going on around that topic now. Yeah. And as a result, I think that, and even the stuff I'm being asked to be on advisory boards, and I'm on a podcast for like venture capitalists last week. So all of that's just taking time. Yeah. But in the end, people will understand that, whoa, 1.3 billion people is a big marketplace for a new business.
It's interesting as well. Like I mean, me and you had a conversation the other week of diversify. Like sometimes within the disabled community, it can feel very echo chambery, and it can feel very hard to bring the wider community in. And I think that's testament to what we just spoke about, of like that whole issue of cancel culture, people saying the wrong thing, people not knowing what to say, but then also people needing to be pressed because they're not getting it. How did you, I don't think I've asked this in this episode so far, like how did you bridge the gap between mainstream and disability? Like obviously there's telling the story and explaining that there's this amount of money that you're not tapping into, but in terms of like opening that conversation and really pulling them in to be able to go, right, we're going to do this. How did that meld together? Because that's a journey I'm on at the moment of how do we bring the wider community in. So how did you do that with Purple Goat and bringing mainstream brands really? How did you tell the story? I'm not articulating the question very well, but yeah, how did you tell the story?
Just to clarify, do you mean the story to the brands or to disabled community? To
the brands. So obviously, like most brands will be run by able-bodied people that have never really been exposed to disability unless they've got family members that have gone through it.
Yeah, so I mean, a business, people get into like, oh, businesses don't do this social, sort of philosophically, culturally sort of thing that they should do. But when you boil it down, a business is set up to make profit by selling a product or a service to consumers. Like if we get a bit economics 101, right? Like that's the purpose of a business, is to make profit. So the first thing is you just say there's this large group of people who have been ignored and underserved from whatever business vertical industry they're in for all our lives, and you point to some sort of insight or statistic. If it's a supermarket or a fashion brand, you find a more specific insight that speaks to that industry.
Yeah.
But most of all, you're just saying you've actually been a bit silly here, because you could have happier customers that you've already got that are disabled but are having a suboptimal experience, and you could bring a load of other people to you as new customers. But to do that, you need to actually talk to some disabled people and get to know what these barriers are, maybe make some changes, but sometimes the changes aren't as big as people think they are. And I mean, from a marketing perspective, we talk about it and the stats a bit dated, but it won't be so much more now than when the research was done, that 0.06% of ads feature disability. But we know there's like, depending, UK is about 20%, I think, in terms of the population have a disability.
Yeah.
I think there's maybe globally it's 15%, but ultimately, if it's somewhere between 15 and 20%, and the actual advertising has 0.06%, like there is just a moral case to like, how about 2% or 3% of your advert?
Yeah.
And that's why influencer works well, because making a TV ad is like one created, disseminated through all the TV stations.
Yeah.
But with influencers, and we know a lot of what I've learned from Go, you can get a better return on investment using social media and influencer marketing, regardless of disability. But it also means you can have representation far more easily, because if you're, spending $1 million on influencer, you can just take some of that budget and give it to Purple Goat, and then we'll work with the right disabled influencers within the disability community. So I don't know if that like totally answers like the kind of you were saying about how you tell the story, but it's those sort of sentiments.
Yeah, no, it completely does. So I think it's really nice to like hear the internal conversations. Like that's one thing I really want to get out of this episode of like, how have you made that journey possible? Because I think all of us see the outside of it. Obviously, I'm a little bit involved in the back end, admittedly, but like that journey of how you got from no one really doing it to being like the leaders in doing it and doing it really well was what I was trying to get out of that question. So thanks. Just as a last couple of questions. One is, I tend to ask this to every guest. What's one piece of advice you'd give to your younger self? Maybe even, probably a piece of advice you'd give me, because we're both both have very similar interests. What's one piece of advice you'd give?
Yeah, when I went from Scope to like doing my own blog and all the stuff that came, there was a kind of what would 15-year-old me have wanted and needed from the world that I didn't have. And that's always been a big fuel for me. And so if you almost turn that into the answer, the advice is almost, it's a bit cliche when you say find your passion, because it's quite intangible, isn't it? Like, how do you find your passion?
Yeah.
But through those years where I was, aware that I wanted to do social change around disability, I was aware that I like business and entrepreneurship, not as a sort of like numbery, financy thing, but as a creative way as a vehicle, almost for the social change. And then the new tools like social media, I'm very interested in AI. So there's something around all of that is like, it is kind of just finding the things you enjoy, but also being the person that you wished was 10 years or 20 years ahead of when you needed it. And so I'm quite fueled by that role modeling, not from a place of ego, but from a place of, God, I just really wish I had that when I was that age. So how awesome is it if other people are going to have that?
It's a very good point of like really analysing what you should focus your time on. That's a really good lens to view it from. Yeah, that's really good. Yeah, that's really cool. Just as a last question, I ask every guest, which is, what's one piece of politically correctness that you really strongly agree with or disagree with? That sounds a lot more serious than it is. It's basically, what's a pet peeve of yours? It doesn't have to be disability related. It can be if you want it to be. It can just be something that winds you up. But it's just a bit of fun at the end of the episode.
One thing I want to throw to you is a compliment of, I love that you're tackling political correctness in humorous ways, but general ways. And I think, we talked a lot today about DEI and disability inclusion. And I think there are so much important things in the world that do need to be changed and fixed. But there are sometimes conversations that are going on that feel a bit sideshow and a bit unhelpful, a bit to your point about cancel culture. There's stuff going on that I guess can create as much harm as it can create progress and change. So I just love what you're doing with the pod and all your work, and tackling this sort of PC thing that we've all known in different ways. I suppose the one that jumped out to me was about triumph over tragedy. And it probably is a little bit more within disability, although I would be not surprised if other DEI strands essentially feel that pressure to triumph over their perceived adversity. And I think that narrative can be damaging for disabled people. Let's stick to that just because that's our lived experience.
Yeah.
There's like a pressure to succeed when, like, what if someone doesn't want to be an entrepreneur, doesn't want to climb up the ranks at a business?
Yeah.
Like, some people, maybe can't work because of health reasons. I think, triumph can have different meanings, but I think that pressure to triumph, that pressure to succeed is, something that can cause as much harm as good. And as always, the paradox and the contradictions. If someone's disabled and they do want to climb Everest or jump out of a plane, crack on and have a great time doing it. Because I know I did a load of crazy shit 10 years ago and I loved every minute of it. And it wasn't to conform to that narrative. But I think it's important that for there to be that distinguished bit as well.
But I completely agree. I do think, like, there's almost this constant pressure of, like, particularly you see it in the physically disabled community of, like, oh, the only reason you're still disabled is because you don't work hard enough. And it's like, no, there's a lot to unpack there, but no. And it's often as well, like, if you can't do these things, you're not helping yourself when actually, like, so to give you a real world example, the way I see it is, like, I was pushed as a kid a lot to do with, like, getting into my walking frame, get walking, get moving, this, that, the other. Now, fast forward 10 years later, I spend more time in my chair than I do in my walking frame. But my argument is I have a better quality of life in my chair than I do in my walking frame because I can still use my hands, I can hold a drink, I can text. Whereas if I'm on my walking frame, if I try and pick my phone up, I'm going face first. That's pretty much it. And I think that you see so much of in the disabled community of, like, just keep going. You have to keep going. If you don't keep going, you're less of a disabled person. It's like, no, like, just let people be. And I think that ties in with everything we spoke about today of, like, almost just let systems be sometimes. So I think, like, there is obviously, as we've said, change is great and we should push for change, but there is an element of, like, some things just is what it is. And
I totally agree. And that even it's kind of, insinuated in what you said anyway, but that I probably spoke about triumph to, like, jump out of planes and that kind of stuff, or to be a successful business person. I think you also touched there on, like, we don't all have to be activist change makers on behalf of disabled people. And, like, again, I've ended up there, but that is because of a real passion and an enjoyment to do something. But if someone's like, I actually just want to, like, go and become a swimming teacher or whatever it might be. I'm just random. My mum's a swimming teacher. Probably why randomly I thought swimming teacher, but ultimately whatever other job doesn't have to be to represent disabled people, which I think you definitely just touched on yourself there, and I really agree with that. And also your point about kind of physio and, like, the health around the disability, like, that could be a whole other episode probably because there's a lot there. But I've noticed sort of seasons in my life. So, like, as a kid, I probably did need someone to be a bit on my case because I wouldn't have done it myself. And that meant I was a bit better health-wise. My 20s, I just didn't do any swimming or physio, and I was just out all the time and living that life. And then into my late 30s, last couple of years, I know that, like, a little bit more what I eat makes a difference. And, like, and then you get into, like, disabled or not disabled. That's just getting older and all that kind of thing. But I think there are different ways that we can and should challenge ourselves to be healthier in our career, volunteering, fulfillment, family relationships. But it should always come from within, you say, not because someone's, like, telling you to do it. And when I say someone, it might be a parent and it might be the Daily Mail going, wheelchair user climbed Everest, and everyone goes, well, hey, So it's doing everything on your terms is what I'm trying to say.
Completely agree. Completely. Thank you so much for coming on, Martyn. It's been such a good episode. Just quickly before we finish, where can people find you if they want to follow your journey and follow what you're up to?
So Purple Go, all things marketing, we're all over LinkedIn, Instagram, website, Google, Purple Go Agency. And me personally, I've still got my blog. I don't always write on it as much as I used to, but martynsibley.com has got like all the stuff I've done over the last 10 years as well. And I'm on all the social media channels as well.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Martyn.
Thanks a lot, mate. See you soon.
Thank you so much for tuning into this week's episode of the Not Quite Podcast. Please make sure you follow us on TikTok and Instagram to get regular updates about the podcast.
These my dollars make it hurt.